A soft hum of gentle wind slowly flowed throughout the air. This quiet tune was broken, however, as every other second the sudden plop of two oar paddles could be heard pushing themselves through the surface of the ocean. Taking in a long, exhausted breath, Mush's eyes glazed over the thick marsh that filled the air around them. The change from clear ocean skies to thick swamp-like fog had been gradual, a change that had taken a full day. It was a sign that the once seemingly endless ocean would soon come to an end, replaced with actual land to traverse. It made Mush feel sick, more so than he already had before, and by anything but a smaller margin as well. While true this had been the case since Chime's return, the feeling of dread had only been piling and piling higher as he had rowed towards the wasteland. Like he was holding a bag over his shoulders, one that was constantly filling with water, one that never seemed to run out of space. It had been another 3 days since Mush and Chime had their frankly useless conversation, and since then Chime had once again settled back into silence. However, unlike before, Chime was not slumped over in a heap. Instead, he was actually sitting upright, though he was leaning forward, his veil of messy and matted hair hiding more of his features. His posture was a far cry from the usual calm and collected he normally displayed. Rather, he sat tapping his feet against the chipped bark. His arm rested on his knee while he drummed his fingers in a rhythm that broke every few seconds. Chime clicked his tongue, gently gritting his teeth to try and distract himself from the growing bundle of nerves that threatened to burst out of control. He was nervous, that much was obvious. However, unlike Mush, Chime had little experience in squashing those kind of emotions down. Therefore, in an attempt to put his mind on something else, Chime looked towards Mush, his voice low and gravely, almost to the point of a growl. "You're going to see them first." Mush's reaction was immediate. His whole body froze as his eyes widened, sweat beginning to roll down his neck. "What?" Mush yelled, dropping the oars, letting them fall back into their holsters as he held out his hands while his fingers curled inwards from both the shock and panic. Chime nodded, the gesture accompanied by an eye roll that Mush of course could not see. "You heard me." Chime spat the tapping against his knee. A tightness pulled itself into Mush's gut as his heartbeat quickened while a lump formed in his throat. His mouth dried as he tried to plead for Chime to change his mind. "You can't," he declared. "If I do, they're gonna. Chime raised his only arm, the clock hand in each of his eyes ticking by slowly as his nerves were quickly replaced with a cold focus. "You are going." Chime's voice was final, full of authority, and to help carry the command, Chime's voice had even lost its rasp, though it was only for a moment. Mush's next argument died in his throat before he slowly slumped back, defeated. Pushing a hand through his hair, Mush took a deep breath to calm himself before he stared into the drape of hair that covered Chime's face, Mush's own expression slowly twisting into the embodiment of dread. Letting out a sharp exhale that Mush tried to keep going for as long as possible, the living flesh in human form reset his eyes on Chime, mentally preparing himself for his next question. All right, Mush's voice came out shaky and full of fear, yet he pushed it down, his constant guilt being the driving force to his pseudo-courage. He rubbed at his neck, wiping away the beads of sweat that sucked to his skin like glue. "So, what do we do then?" Chime huffed, his chest heaving as he did so, although he paid it no mind as he hummed in thought. "Simple," he stated. "You go in first, let them get some much-needed vengeance, and then I'll sneak around and heal them." Mush nodded slowly, the idea making him flinch. "Okay. But you will get there fast enough so they don't, you know." Chime smirked, a rare sight that still sent Mush reeling. However, he was still able to tell that it was in fact a confirmation. Now, with nothing left to say, Chime leaned back to his initial posture. However, a small smirk still tugged at the corner of his lips, the thought of what would soon happen to Mush filling him with a twisted kind of glee. With shaking hands, Mush tightly gripped the paddles of the boat, his whole body beginning to tremble as he carefully began to row once again. Over the past 6 days that Mush had spent taking himself and Chime to the wasteland, the living flesh in human form had stupidly thought that just maybe Chime would have healed the others before letting them go after him. It was utterly moronic in hindsight. Of course, Chime would never pass up such an opportunity, especially after all these years. Mush didn't blame him. He knew for a fact if he were in Chime's shoes he would have done the same. That did little to help calm himself, though, and like a punchline to a bad joke, the thick marsh that filled the air began to thin slightly, letting both Mush and Chime spot the silhouettes of small patches of land that floated off in the distance. Mush felt his mouth go dry once more as he tried to push the still growing nerves back down. Without thinking, Mush turned to Chime, who had gone back to his skittish foot tapping while his elbow sat digging into his thigh. That made Mush blink, somehow having only just noticed the new habit even though Chime had been doing it for the past 3 days. Taking a risk, Mush decided to try and ask a question, and while his intent was to simply help his old friend, that didn't cut out the possibility of Chime taking it as some kind insult before foregoing his constant mercy. The odds made Mush shiver. Yet still, he asked, "Are you ready for this?" His tone was gentle and light, his voice in a near whisper. Chime's head tilted upwards slowly, each degree of movement making his neck crack with a constant sickening pop. A long exhale leaked from Chime's mouth, the air around the boat beginning to chill slightly. "Am I ready for this?" Mush flinched, the cold, dead tone from Chime making it clear he was in fact taking it as an insult. Mush tried to backpedal, shaking his head frantically while Chime stared him down. Wait, I mean, you look nervous." That statement, while true, felt strange on Mush's tongue, almost like eating pufferfish, just without any of the danger. Chime paused, the chilling in the air vanishing as he processed Mush's apparent observation. He blinked, looking at his tapping foot, before he paused again. "Huh?" Chime eventually let out a long sigh, his tone becoming more casual, although it never lost that edge of disdain. "Never felt this before. I don't like it." Mush knew that for an absolute fact. He tried to chuckle, though it came out more as a broken wheeze, the kind of sound someone having a nervous breakdown would make. Chime huffed, turning his head to the side while his voice became a small whisper. "I'll manage," was his only answer. Mush's face twisted into one of painful doubt, biting his lip, though he quickly as to prevent another one of Chime's assertive reactions. Much like the rest of Mush's feelings, his doubt was mixed. On the one hand, everything that Chime was doing, the feet tapping, the slow heavy breaths, the constant shuffling, all pointed to him not being in the right headspace to move onwards. But on the other hand, Mush, for the life of him, just could not imagine Chime messing it up, or anything for that matter. Now lost in his own thoughts, Mush lost track of his surroundings, leaving him unable to brace himself as the boat suddenly banked on a small dent of mud. Mush caught himself on the boat's edges as it swayed for another second longer. Mush looking forward as Chime slowly picked himself up from his seat, taking a moment to crack his back, though he was still clearly lost in thought. Chime's gaze glossed over to grassy land just ahead on the boat before he slowly leaned down and re-equipped the cane that Mush had created, the smooth wooden surface fitting snugly in his palm. Without another word, Chime slowly hobbled his way out the boat, each step swaying his stickman-like figure. Mush followed after in more of a rush as he leapt off the boat to follow his old friend, who was moving ahead without a word. After Mush was able to catch his breath, he fell into step behind Chime, following the one-armed man as he moved further and further into the wasteland. Mush craned his neck from left to right, taking in the sight of their surroundings. Roaring winds that were tinted a dirty yellow hid the horizon from view, although that wasn't really a cause for concern, as most of the area was simply a dull grass plain with a few broken structures just barely visible off in the distance. Mush dug a finger into his ear in an attempt to rid himself of a constant ringing that bounced around his eardrum, though he had little success. It was that momentary distraction that left Mush unaware of Chime, who had suddenly changed course, turning to the right as the wind died down, revealing an old wooden barn, one that had been chopped horizontally in half. Chime stared at the destroyed barn house with a look of slow recollection, his eyebrows rising slightly as he got lost in thought so much that he completely failed to notice Mush, who was moving to stand behind him, a look of confusion on his face. With a causal turn, Chime once again ignored Mush as the one-armed man kept moving, this time towards a singular tree off in the distance, a seemingly random landmark to the unaware, but to Chime it acted like an arrow pointing them in the right direction. As the two moved onwards, Mush dived deeper and deeper into his thoughts. He was scared, there was no other way to put it. Each step felt like being struck by lightning, each breath made his throat feel as if it was being filled with cement, and each second sent him closer and closer to spiraling. Mush slammed his shaking hands into the pocket of his hoodie, while he dug his neck into the collar, trying and failing to provide himself any kind of comfort or relief. Ideas of what could happen flashed in his mind, and in all of them one thing was true: it was going to hurt. It wasn't the idea of the physical pain that made Mush want to vomit. No, he knew he could handle whatever injuries the others threw at him. No. It was the mental and emotional side that pulled at Mush's chest. The very thought of it made him feel sick. Their faces, the looks they would give him, the screams of rage and hate. Mush mentally slapped himself as a part of him tried to bring up the idea of running away. that made the pull in his chest worse as a torrent of even greater self-loathing pulsed throughout him. Chime tried to straighten himself as he hobbled forward, the cane that Mush had made clutched tightly in his bony hand. Just like before on the boat, Chime felt a chilling wave of nerves wash over him, his mind unable to figure out what to do to counteract the feeling. Much like Mush, Chime began to imagine how the upcoming event would go. However, unlike Mush, Chime couldn't help but smile at what he was envisioning. The clock hand in each of his eyes losing just a bit of their rusted ticking, turning into something smoother. Something almost like before the cycle. Quickly shaking their heads, both Chime and Mush cleared their minds of most thoughts as they just kept moving forward further and further into the wasteland. Meanwhile, near the center of the entire wasteland, a certain batch of key individuals were about to gather. Dirty yellow winds swirled in a circular pattern, forming a barrier that only a select few could cross. Near the edge of the barrier stood, or rather floated, the north wind, the living form of air twitching violently as each second ticked by, its patience growing thinner and thinner with each passing moment. Inside the mind of the north wind, a chorus of voices screamed over one and another, while just one of the many sufferings that the north wind's broken mind had to endure. However, unlike any other day where the voices would scream complete gibberish, the endless sea of sounds all screeched about one thing, that being Chime, or rather what he could think of the north wind after all that he had done. He'll get it. He'll get it. He'll get it. The voices screamed, all while memories of every last crime the north winds had committed flashed through his mind. The north wind craned its neck in random directions with enough degree of movement to break a normal person's neck instantly. The voices screeched again, trying to rationalize. He will understand. He has to. It makes perfect sense. It doesn't matter what we did, since everything resets, then there's no point, so what, we were just having some fun, making sure to respect ourselves. Yes, yes. Exactly like he said, he will surely understand. The north wind cackled, his voice echoing throughout the barrier. The logic was flawed, easy to pick apart, a myriad of holes appearing once anyone thought about it for more than a second, yet to the mangled mind of the north wind it made perfect sense. Abruptly pausing his twitching, the north wind twisted to his left as he felt a change in the barrier of wind as a figure pushed their way through. A very familiar figure. Thick fingers pushed through the wall of wind, first their dark green coloring acting as a distinct contrast to the dirty yellow that made up the air. The silhouette of the figure became more clear as they pushed further and further through the barrier before, after another few seconds, the ferryman stepped through in all his mysterious glory. Faster than the human eye could see, the north wind raised his arm, a ball of razor-sharp air gathering around him, just waiting to be unleashed towards the ferryman, who simply stared at the north wind with a gentle gaze. The living wind froze on the spot, the swirling vortex of roaring winds dissipating instantaneously. He lowered his arm slowly, saying nothing, not a word, yet the ferryman understood perfectly. The ferryman slowly nodded, a gesture that held more weight than any kind of words. A silence pulled itself between the two, with the ferryman slowly sighing as he reached into his coat to pull out a wooden flask. He chugged the amber liquid, shutting his eyes as he did so, simply listening to the whistling of the wind around him. Unlike the north wind or the others, the ferryman had managed to mostly keep his sanity over the cycles, his mind being much calmer in comparison. However, while from an outside point of view that may have seemed like something to celebrate, but at times it acted more as a curse, as the ferryman was always painfully aware of both his surroundings and the consequences to his actions. He hated it, or rather he hated himself, a voice in the back of his mind always berating him for now doing better, for not doing more, for failing to stop the cycle in the first place. Chugging the last of his drink, the ferryman sighed once again, twisting the cap back onto the flask before he shoved it back into his pockets, before he let his arms fall to his side. The ferryman swayed in his spot, letting the breeze that leaked from the barrier push him in whichever direction it so desired, as he tried to clear his mind of all thoughts, because if he didn't, he was sure the anticipation would have driven him into a nervous wreck. The ferryman's attempt at calming himself was halted, however, as he felt the gaze of the north wind bore into the back of his neck. With an exhausted turn, the ferryman returned the north wind's stare, matching it with the rock-hard certainty that the north wind had grown to know over the cycle. Just like before, silence was the only thing that stuck between the two as the north wind twitched with increasing intensity, while the ferryman kept his gaze steady, filled with both exhaustion and unbridled joy for what was soon to come. Before any conversation could take place, another figure pushed itself through the barriers, the trails of smoke leaking through the wall of wind acting as the only warning before the Mirror Man stepped fully through his sudden presence, drawing the North Wind's and Ferryman's attention immediately. Straightening his back, the Mirror Man tried to stand tall as he met the gaze of both the North Wind and Ferryman. However, both the Manic Wind and the Guide to Nowhere could easily see through the facade. The Mirror Man held his slender hands behind his back, contrasting with the rest of his figure, which was only slightly above average weight. Despite his best efforts, the Mirror's Man body began to shake every few seconds, each shiver sending puffs of smoke into the air. It was a telltale sign of his fractured mind. The only difference between him and the North Wind was that the Mirror Man was better at hiding it. Yet his mask was cracking. The upcoming reunification brings the Mirror Man's mask from just one chip away from shattering completely. Gritting his currently non-existent teeth, the Mirror Man forced himself to move, strutting towards a more open space before he clicked his polished shoes together, standing straight and tall. The three figures stood in silence, once more the Mirror Man's sudden presence doing little to change anything. However, the Master of Illusion did received another passing glance from the Ferryman, who tipped his hat towards, just like the North Wind. A quick flinch was his reply as the Mirror Man turned his smoke-filled head towards nothing in particular content, to simply wait for the next few events to play out naturally. Abruptly, the North Wind jolted like he was suddenly slapped on the back. He curved round to the second-last open space within the barrier, the Fairy and Mirror Man also shifting to where the North Wind was staring. A hand shot out of barrier, tiny in comparison, yet that never stopped them from swinging their arm, enough force to blow a titanic hole open, wide enough for both the Mirror and Ferryman to fit through easily. Tiny footsteps slammed against the dirt, each step digging dark green shoes into the earth, caking the footwear with mud and a few worms, yet the wearer either didn't notice or did not care as they hunched forward. Pure white hair stuck to their face, completely soaked, just like the rest of their tiny body. However, just like their shoes, they didn't care. Instead, they huffed and panted like a rabid beast, keeping their fingers curled like the shadows themselves would soon reach out and attack. The Pretender kept the same stance for a few moments, the only oversound she made being a set, unintelligent mumbles that not even she herself could decipher. She suddenly looked upwards, most likely thanks to a cough the Mirror Man had not so casually forced outwards. She froze on the spot like a deer in headlights, somehow having completely forgotten that the others would also be waiting for Chime. She twitched much like the North Wind before she mumbled something else under his breath, her tone a mix of offense and defense. And so the four settled into a tense quiet, the only remaining sounds being the random mutters from the Pretender or a sudden twitch from the North Wind. The Ferryman shifted slightly as the other three got lost in their mangled minds. There was so much he wanted to say, so much he wanted to do. Yet he didn't. He could only stand perfectly still as he shoved his hands back into his pockets in order to counter the chilling winds that nipped at his fingertips. His heart beat with far greater sensitivity, to the point where he could feel the individual sections of pulse as opposed to just the thing as a whole. It was driving him insane. The waiting, the silence. Yet for the life of him, he had no idea what to say, his mind going completely blank before he could start even the simplest of thoughts. He tapped his boot against the ground for a few seconds, a sign of his wavering patience. The shaking form of the Mirror Man stood the furthest away from everyone inside the barrier. It was a subconscious reflex, something he himself didn't even realize yet. As his mind began to wonder, he felt a familiar pang of pain shoot through his shattered psyche. Flashes of memories pulled themselves to the front of his broken mind, blowing away the smoke that clouded his thoughts. Each flash felt like a punch to the gut, each time skinning deeper and deeper into his soul. The worst part, however, most of the memories were fake. Delusions his destroyed mind had conjured to forget the pain of reality. Sharp breaths escaped from the clenched teeth of the Pretender as her stance turned into something still defensive, yet now she was at least standing upright. She kept her shoulders squared and tense as her heart pounded in her ears. Her mind was mostly blank. That had been true since she had freed herself from the depths around the nest. She had been moving on pure instinct, dead set on simply reaching where she was now. But then she paused, everything finally catching up with her as she took in a few very much needed deep breaths. Suddenly she began to quiver before she devolved into a shaking mess, one that looked like someone who had been staying in pouring endless rain for hours. Her stance changed, going from an animal backed into a corner to something weaker, vulnerable. The north wind twitched for the umpteenth time while he craned his neck to glance at everyone else inside the barrier. It felt strange to say the least to see them all again. He couldn't remember the last time the four of them had been together in one place. Well, that was a lie. He could remember the very day when they began to break apart. The hopeless of an unwinnable war having finally broken them all. Mush stood outside the barrier of wind, watching as it surrounded the area in front of him. He swallowed another lump in his throat, his hands now shaking like a leaf. He was standing alone, Chime having left to go prepare himself while he sent Mush to get the others' attention. Once again the thought terrified him. His teeth chattered with enough force to send lines of pain into his chest, adding on to the even greater pain that pooled in his lungs. His feet felt like they were encased in concrete, causing him to freeze any time he tried to take a step forward. He did move eventually, no matter how much his remaining self-preservation's instincts said otherwise. His feet carried him forward even as he leaned back on instinct, and before he knew it, he was but inches away from the wall of wind, the dirty yellow seeming to somehow stare back at him. Mush froze for a few seconds before he raised his hand, his palm now millimeters away from the wall. He slammed his eyes shut, biting away any thoughts or images that tried to force their way to the front of his mind before he let out a defiant yell, his palm slamming against the wall with enough force to send ripples along the entire thing. The north wind twitched for the umpteenth time while he craned his neck to glance at everyone else inside the barrier. It felt strange to say the least to see them all again. He couldn't remember the last time the four of them had been together in one place. Well, that was a lie. He could remember the very day when they began to break apart. The hopeless of an unwinnable war having finally broken them all. Mush stood outside the barrier of wind, watching as it surrounded the area in front of him. He swallowed another lump in his throat, his hands now shaking like a leaf. He was standing alone, Chime having left to go prepare himself while he sent Mush to get the others' attention. Once again the thought terrified him. His teeth chattered with enough force to send lines of pain into his chest, adding on to the even greater pain that pooled in his lungs. His feet felt like they were encased in concrete, causing him to freeze any time he tried to take a step forward. He did move eventually, no matter how much his remaining self-preservation's instincts said otherwise. His feet carried him forward even as he leaned back on instinct, and before he knew it, he was but inches away from the wall of wind, the dirty yellow seeming to somehow stare back at him. Mush froze for a few seconds before he raised his hand, his palm now millimeters away from the wall. He slammed his eyes shut, biting away any thoughts or images that tried to force their way to the front of his mind before he let out a defiant yell, his palm slamming against the wall with enough force to send ripples along the entire thing. The barrier fizzled away instantly, though not by the force of Mush's strike, rather it was pulled to a stop. The rushing winds it was made of freezing within moments, canceling out the thing as a whole. Mush felt his entire body lock into place as he met the gaze of the others. They all stared directly at him, all having frozen completely in a mix of shock and disbelief, all of them never once making a move or saying a sound. Mush began to shake in pure terror while he oh so slowly raised his hands, trying his best to wave. However, the gesture came out rigid and rusty. H.H.H.H.H. Hey G. Guys. Within mere moments the pretender appeared in front of Mush, before her fist crashed into his face. Mush flew through the air, clutching at his face while blood gushed from his nose. His landing was anything from graceful, his whole body bouncing off a boulder that laid planted in the ground. He hobbled upwards, his body shaking from both pain and fear as he held up his hands in surrender, his voice yelling out his plea. Wait, 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 wait. His begging fell on deaf's ears, the pretender appearing in front of him once again with inhuman speed, her form seeming as nothing more than flickering lines of white and green. Just like before, her fist rushed towards Mush, the force of the incoming strike splitting the air around it. Her fist slammed under his chin, his jaw breaking on impact before he flew into the air, while he tried his best to ignore the pain as well as protecting himself the best he could. A shadow quickly loomed over Mush, causing him to squint his mostly occupied mind, trying to figure out the reason for the change in lighting. The reason, as it turned out, was the ferryman who had leaped into the air high above Mush, his fist clamped together like a hammer. His titanic fists collided with Mush's tiny form, the swing fueled by blind rage and hate, sending Mush soaring back towards the ground. The ground he never reached. The space directly below Mush began to glow a soft white, the light shaping itself into a simple rectangle that was about twice Mush's size. The light died out quickly, revealing itself to be a floating pane of glass, one that stayed floating in the air while Mush still flew towards it. The second Mush made contact with the pane, it glowed white once again, somehow pulling Mush inside like he was falling through water. Mush felt the direction of his fall change, turning from downwards to sideways before he crashing onto the earth, tumbling to a stop after a few moments. Mush tried to recover, coughing as he did so, his broken jaw hanging uselessly, yet he paid it no mind, even with the jolts of pain that coursed throughout it. However, as soon as Mush lifted his head upwards, his already panic-filled eyes were met by the sight of a drill, one at least 4 times his size, that was made of roaring purple and black streaks of wind, and it was streaming towards him, aiming for the center of his chest. He tried to defend himself, raising a shaking arm ready to send out a wall of flesh to block the attack. He never got the chance. Another flash of white light appeared, this one a much more angular shape, while also only being large enough to fit Mush's hand. Before Mush could react, his hand reached into the miniature portal, and while he quickly realizing his fatal error, however, it was too late, as the portal closed in on itself, instantly severing Mush's hand. Rather than blood, a mass of reddish-pink, bulging flesh seeped out of the wound like rotten curdled milk. A bark of pain was all Mush was able to let out before the drill of wind slammed into his chest once again, sending Mush flying into the air, while the drill continued to rip away, digging a gaping hole into his chest, making Mush roll his eyes backwards from the overwhelming pain. The instant Mush began to decelerate, the gigantic hand of the ferryman clutched at Mush's tiny form, snatching the living flesh out of the air with full force. The ferryman stomped forward each step, breaking the ground below him as he moved in front of another rock, this one much larger and sturdier. He opened his hand, revealing that Mush had stuck to his palm like the corpse of a bug, his tiny form twitching and seething, the combined assault pushing his durability to his upper limits. The ferryman's face morphed into a rage-filled scowl before he lifted his open palm above his head. Within seconds, Mush was slammed against the boulder, the echoing crunch of his bones snapping into pieces acting like music to the ferryman's ears. The strike was repeated with just as much fury, if not more. Then it happened again. And again. After the 5th strike, Mush was now nothing more than a stain that smeared against the surface of the boulder, his limbs twisted and crumpled that jutted out in random directions. A barrage of huffs and pants leaked from the ferryman's melted face while he slowly raised his arms again, forming another hammer strike to send crashing towards the barely alive Mush. He never got the chance. The pretender shot towards the crumpled Mush like a bullet, once again appearing as nothing more than flickering lines of white and green. She tackled him like a wild beast, the impact having enough force to explode the boulder into minuscule pieces, while also sending Mush streaming into the air once again. However, this time the pretender was holding on with a vice grip, her teeth bared like fangs as she clutched at both of Mush's arms from the shoulders. Mush regained a sliver of consciousness just as the pretender lifted her feet, her shoes planting themselves into the wound on Mush's chest that one brought about by the drill of wind. Now standing on Mush while he flew back towards the ground, the pretender snarled again, her mind filled with nothing but hatred for the person in front of her. Her hands dug into his shoulder, breaking the skin effortlessly, the curled flesh that hid under Mush's skin trying to wriggle away in fear. Just like with the miniature portal, Mush realized what the pretender was planning that bit too late, although he still tried to plead again, his voice come out in a garbled mess as blood pooled in his throat. "Please!" he begged, his face contorting in grief and guilt. "It's not a trick, I promise." The pretender shrieked a feral sound that burst Mush's ear drums, the blood shooting outwards as her hatred magnified tenfold. And so she pulled. Flesh and bones were ripped apart like cheap withered fabric, Mush's now severed arms being flung away without a thought, while bubbles of rotting flesh shot out from Mush's new wounds, different bundles contracting and expanding mid-air, trying desperately to return to their source. Gags of incalculable pain were all Mush was able to muster, while the pretender pushed herself off of his failing form before he crashed back into the dirt, rolling into a heap. Somehow Mush was able to look ahead of himself, his mind just barely handing on. The pretender was the first to land, the force kicking up a dust cloud its size only tempered by her own tiny form. The north wind arrived next, forming from streams of black and purple wind that gathered next to the pretender. Next was the ferryman, who crashed down from the sky with a landing that nearly matched the pretender's intensity. However, his titanic frame kept his front covered in shadows, leaving him as nothing more than a silhouette in Mush's blurry eyes. Last but not least, the Mirror Man appeared by exiting through another portal, this one much more akin to a random shard of glass compared to the clean, perfect rectangle he used on Mush. Mush narrowed his eyes, somehow still able to keep himself awake. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the adrenaline, maybe it was the fact his regeneration was starting to take effect. But what he did know was that a certain one-armed figure had appeared behind the rest of his old friends. A mix between a scowl and a grin plastered on his face at the sight of Mush's current state. Somehow, someway, Mush let out a chuckle that mixed with a gurgle of blood, his eyes suddenly growing 10 times heavy as he met the gaze of Chime. Letting his head fall onto the grass, Chime coughed out another pool of blood. He sighed, saying the first thing that came to mind. Fair enough. The Pretender, Northwind, Ferryman, and Mirror Man all stepped forward, each ready to rip Mush apart. That's when the world glitched. The 4 attackers frozen like someone hit a simple pause button, while the ring of a distant clock bell echoed throughout the air. The space around the 4 began to distort, turning a bright green that glitched with constantly increasing intensity. Over the next few seconds, certain aspects of the 4 began to rewind. It was different for each of them. For people like the Mirror and Ferryman, the rewind affected certain sections of their mental state alongside their physicality, whereas for the Northwind and the Pretender it went to work purely healing their broken minds. As quickly as the glitching green energy appeared, it also vanished, although with none of the subtlety. Rather, the energy compacted itself before it burst outwards in a flash of light. The Mirror Man groaned as he suddenly found himself in a heap upon the ground, his head spinning, as if he was just flung out of a washing machine. Without thinking, he reached up to rub at his eyes that were actually there instead of smoke. In pure shock and utter disbelief, the Mirror Man quickly clasped his hands over his face, and sure enough, rather than endless smoke, the Mirror Man could feel actual skin. Before he himself had noticed, the Mirror Man was mumbling out any observations he could while simultaneously taking into account his change in outfit, using that as a key piece to the sudden puzzle. Back to 6-no-17? But the Mirror Man pushed his palm against his forehead, his vision still only just unblurring. He was confused. That was the simplest way to put it, even if it oh so dramatically undersold the emotions swirling inside his mind. His coherent mind. The Mirror Man froze, and so too did the Northwind, the Ferryman, and the Pretender, all of them moving a slightly shaking hand towards the side of their heads, the greatest aspect finally able to be appreciated. Everything was quiet. There were no voices, no raging thoughts that thrashed around their minds. For the first time in oh so many years and cycles, their minds were at peace. They all got up slowly like a newborn fawn trying to stand for the first time. They all stood in place, still reeling from the realization that somehow, someway their minds, their sanity, had been restored. Confusion was the first thing what came over the 4, their recent memories still slightly fuzzy, until a low, raspy voice sounded from behind them, carrying 240,000 years of constantly building emotion. The air turned still, the sudden silence acting as a chain that bound everyone in place, no one willing to make a move. Although that didn't last long, with the Pretender breaking the deadlock by lifting her head upwards slightly, her body beginning to tremble. It didn't stop her, however, as with sheer will she broke free of the indescribable emotions that held her in place. Bit by bit her neck ticked towards the voice, her wet matted hair parting just enough to leave her eyes exposed, just enough to take in the full view. Her eyes widened in complete disbelief, her mind screeching to a halt. He was right there. He had stepped closer in the time that she and the others had taken to recenter themselves, allowing Chime to make his way to be just a few steps away from them. His only arm hung loosely at his side. His breaths were slow and barely noticeable, and most obviously of all, his legs were shaking. The two were at eye level, letting deep violet irises stare into the bright glowing green light that slipped through the cracks in Chime's drape of hair. She turned to fully face him, her movements now an eerily calm, a calm that made Chime flinch in surprise. "Chime?" she asked, voice beginning to quiver. Said boy raised his hand while he tried to wave, however, he only managed to let his wrist tremble. The Pretender's face suddenly shifted, a frown pulling at her lips while her eyes squeezed shut, before warm tears started to streak down her cheeks. Chime tensed his hand, shooting it outwards even though it never reached, while he tried to soothe, to comfort, to calm, yet all that left his throat was a couple of rasps. Before he could make another attempt, the Pretender shot directly at him, her speed matching the peak of her assault against Mush. She slammed into his chest, the force of the impact sending shockwaves through the air behind them both. Yet somehow someway Chime only skidded back by a few feet as he planted his feet to help them both skid to a stop. She was crying. No, she was wailing. That Chime knew for certain as tears seeped through both his jacket and shirt. She wailed a mess of incoherent sounds that held no structure or message. Instead they acted as raw, unbridled emotions that flooded outwards as the stockpiled pain of 240,000 years of pain was finally being released. Chime's arm reached towards her back, his heart racing with panic. However, just as he tried to wrap his arm around her back, an arm made of black and purple wind suddenly hooked around his neck, pulling him backwards. It was the north wind, who was now jumping up and down like a child on Christmas, his hands pushing down from atop Chime's shoulder, while he screamed in pure and utter exhilaration. The living wind shouted out a barrage of glee-filled cheers, his bouncing only increasing in vigor with each passing second. Chime! 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 He bellowed, continuing to pull Chime's neck back and forth like a slinky. You're here, you're actually... ha 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 ha. The firm thud of booted footsteps made the north wind cease his shaking of Chime, the one-armed boy quickly trying to blink away his blurry vision. Chime watched as the ferryman stepped closer, although he looked far different from the Titan that was previously standing before. He was smaller for one, now matching the general size of Chime, the Pretender and the North Wind. His outfit had remained the same, however his core appearance was now drastically different. Gone was the melted green-skinned face that drooped down to his waist, rather it had turned remarkably human, though he still had a few noticeable features that would turn most heads in any normal setting. He was about half a head shorter than the other three, but for what he lacked in height, he made up for in width as bulky shoulders tensed with each step he took. Pricked tufts of silver hair cascaded through the edges of his hat, reaching down just a little ways past his forehead, highlighting his eyes, which more so resembled black voids, as if his eyes were hollowed out and only the sockets remained. It was the ferryman's true form, one he had never dared to return to since the beginning of the cycle. He stepped forward again, each slight impact of his feet hitting the ground acting like shockwaves that coursed through his bones, causing his knees to involuntarily buckle. He pushed through it, curling his fingers in sheer defiance, though he was only able to take another step forward before his legs locked into place. With his left hand, the ferryman reached up to the thick woolly jumper that clung to his skin, slipping a couple of fingers inside the collar to pull it away as beads of sweat traveled downwards without restraint. He was staring at Chime's eyes, or rather he was staring at the glowing light that remained caged behind his veil of hair. Slowly the ferryman reached his free hand towards Chime, his face contorting with shock, disbelief, but above all else hope. "See, Captain?" He wheezed out, his voice still holding a firm gruffness to it, yet it was now unable to hide the unimaginable number of layers of exhaustion that hide beneath. Rather than responding with words, Chime instead sent out his only arm, grasping the ferryman's outstretched hand with strength that completely contradicted with his frail frame. The ferryman froze upon contact, his stance wavering once again, the grip feeling surreal in his hand. His mind did eventually process that the current situation was in fact real. And as soon as he did, he laughed. It was a loud and heavy sound, one that to the ferryman felt like having an ocean's worth of water lifted off his back. The last to join the reunification was the mirror man, who slowly pulled himself up from the dirt, running a hand through slick, well-combed brown hair. The twitching of his left hand brought his attention to the pair of glasses that he subconsciously held between his fingers. Without much thought, he slid the circular lenses and wooden frame up his long, angular-shaped nose, the glasses fitting perfectly, granting his vision clarity he had never thought he would see again. With twitching hands, the mirror man quickly tried to pat away any specks of dirt off his gray suit vest before he repeated the process along his black dress pants. He hooked both arms around his back, each of his hands clutching around his forearms in an attempt to calm himself as his polished shoes dug into the dirt with each step. After another few seconds, the mirror man took his place next to the ferryman before he turned his gaze towards Chime. His towering figure hung over the one-armed boy, the mirror man's face contorting much like the ferryman's. However, he leaned more into the shock and disbelief. You're alive." The mirror man's eyes widened as he spoke, each second his brain spent processing the situation, only adding to his shaking. The mirror man's shaky statement brought the final pieces to the Five's reunification. They were all overflowing with emotions that couldn't be stressed enough as the pretender continued her sobbing. The north wind kept bouncing on his feet, though he had ceased his rocking of Chime's shoulder, allowing the one-armed boy to stay upright. The ferryman kept both hands clutched around Chime palm, his laughter still booming throughout the air. To contradict the vocal expressions of the north wind, ferryman and pretender the mirror man stood frozen, his mind still locked into place. Before either of the four could continue with their crying, cheering, or laughing, Chime suddenly tensed his hands, ripping away from the ferryman's grip to clutch at his own chest. The four went silent instantly, all pulling away while Chime curled in on himself slightly. His body trembled, his teeth pressed together, all while the other four stood completely still, unsure of what to do, as if Chime were a ticking time bomb that would go off at the slightest touch. None of the four had to make a move, however, as Chime suddenly ceased all forms of shaking, instead shifting to an eerie stillness. They flinched, each briefly reaching towards Chime, who had suddenly begun to make a near-silent sound. A chuckle. Chime reeled his head backwards, the light of his eyes shining into the sky, all while he cackled. Much like the ferryman, Chime's laugh echoed throughout the sky, yet it felt different. More triumphant. More victorious. It turned into something softer, however, as droplets of clear green glitching liquid rolled off his chin. They were his tears. That was something the other four noticed immediately, as the mirror man let out a deep sigh of relief before he dropped his head. The ferryman clutched at his chest, reflexively holding back his own bark of laughter. The north wind somehow cheered with even greater intensity, now bouncing off the balls of his feet like a jackhammer. And finally the pretender resumed her sobbing, though it was mixed in alongside her own collection of laughs. Thus the floodgates opened without restraint, the collective release of grief acting like the light at the end of the tunnel, a moment the five had been anticipating for all the years and cycles. And then there was Mush. The pain was nothing short of agonizing. Left crumbled in a heap of missing limbs and broken bones, Mush found he was only able to choke out his sobs. He wasn't upset, he wasn't even delusional enough to feel even the slightest hint of annoyance. He knew he deserved it. If anything, he was shocked that Chime had acted as quickly as he did. Abruptly Mush's wounded body began to heal itself as more curdled flesh started to ooze out of his wounds, though it was most channeled towards his now missing arms. The writhing flesh leaked outwards, its almost liquid-like form somehow bubbling as if it were molten tar. The flesh slowly reshaped itself while also changing its coloring, and after another few moments, Mush had himself a new pair of arms, ones that were just as sickly pale as the rest of him. The same occurred for the rest of his wounds, Mush feeling the flesh seep throughout his insides, working to repair any amount of damage he suffered. It was anything but pleasant. It felt like his wounds were being both set on fire and dipped in acid at the same time. Mush bit his tongue, holding back the pain, while he sat upright, resting a hand against his chest. After a deep breath, Mush felt the ringing in his ears subside, allowing him to listen to what was happening just a little ways in front of him. The laughing, the sobbing, the cheering. A sudden pang in his heart made Mush freeze, an almost forgotten feeling pulling itself throughout his mind. It took him a second to realize just what he was feeling. But the moment he did, his self-hatred reached new heights. It was jealousy, a simple enough feeling for Mush to identify, yet that did little to stop the rising vial that threatened to burst out from his throat. Biting his tongue, Mush began to curl his fingers in growing rage while his teeth ground together like whetstones. It wasn't the jealousy itself that made Mush feel so sick, rather it was the fact that just maybe he thought he deserved to be jealous. Even after everything he had done. Damn it, Mush spat out, his voice a whisper, however it seemed just a little too loud as the laughs of the other five died out in an instant, all of them going silent before they slowly turned to the living flesh. Chime, the pretender, the Northwind, the ferryman and the mirror man all turned towards Mush with the pace of a rusted clock. Instinctively Mush threw his arms above his head and his neck towards the ground, his body locking into place once he had done so. Mush kept his head down, unable to look any of them in the eye. Ah! Everyone but Chime whispered the chill in their voices, putting absolute zero to shame. Mush flinched, his hands now beginning to quiver. Another few seconds of silence passed before the North Wind leaned forward, wrapping an arm over Chime's shoulder, while his voice went from slow skepticism to near manic delight. Oh, the North Wind started, still lightly bouncing off the balls of his feet. Did you leave him alive so we can all kill him together? The others perked up at that, all clearly liking the idea. Mush flinched again, still half expecting Chime to go back on his promise, yet to his surprise Chime raised his hand slowly, his voice coming out in painful regret. "No," he stated slowly. "We need him, remember." The other four looked confused, though it was only for a moment, as soon enough certain memories replayed themselves in their minds. Chime sighed, his disappointment and reluctance evident. Still he tried to push past it, taking a step forward to regain the others' attention. That's when his knees buckled, his body lurching forward as he clutched at his chest, involuntarily letting out a hiss of pain. In a flash the four reached out, holding Chime upright while he coughed. No one dared to move. Instead they all simply waited for Chime to do something, for they themselves didn't have the first clue if they should act, let alone of what to do if they did. With a long, heavy groan, Chime pulled himself back to an upright position, though he clearly strained himself as he did so. The collective sigh of relief that washed over the group acted like a calm reset button. However, it didn't completely dispel the tense atmosphere. Before anyone could comment on Chime's condition, the north wind began to wave his arms around like a hyperactive child in an overly energetic attempt to gain the others' attention. Okay. He stammered out, his voice growing shakier as he tried to form a proper sentence. "Shouldn't we deal with, in a bit?" The north wind pointed to Mush and then to Chime. "I mean, you look." The rest of the message never needed to be spoken, as Chime simply nodded, a gesture that made the north wind drop his shoulders in relief. The north wind held out his arms, his voice turning more excited as he formed a temporary plan. Right, I have this house-based thing." The north wind rubbed the back of his neck nervously while the rest of the group gave him a set of blank stares. Chime let out a long sigh, his head tilting to the side slightly. "It's a cave filled with random junk, isn't it?" The north wind paused, before he chuckled, the sound being light and low. "Yeah," he replayed simply, his voice losing any kind of quiver. Not wanting to wait any longer, the north wind took charge, quickly bouncing away in what seemed like a random direction. Mush watched as the group began walking away, his still slightly blurry vision picking up on the small instances that hate-filled glares were sent his way. He winced both from pain and guilt as he slowly stood on wobbly knees. He wrapped an arm around his side, the pain from his regeneration still burning away. However, he tried to pay it no mind, instead using the fact he currently had no sleeves as a distraction. With only a slight amount of concentration, Mush held out both his arms, tensing them to the point they shook. More reddish-pink flesh seeped out his skin, covering his arms like papier-mâché. After a few more seconds, the flesh that coated Mush's arm performed a similar transformation, though it was of less scale. The flesh changed both its color and structure, joining itself with the torn ends of his clothing, fixing them to the point of being nearly brand new. Mush waved his arms, gently adjusting to the new feeling on his skin before he shoved his hands into the pocket of his hoodie, as he began to follow after Chime and the others, making sure to keep a good amount of distance between him and the group, though not before he picked up the cane that Chime had left behind. The small journey that the six embarked on, what for the most part rather simple and boring, the scenery of the wasteland never changing from the dirty yellow grass that covered the horizon. The group didn't really care about the view. Instead, each of the four diverted their full focus onto Chime. They tried to make general small talk, though the attempts withered away before they could begin. Every time one of them tried to start a sentence, they would cut themselves off, not finding the topic good enough. It never mattered. Chime would pick up on his friend's nerves, as he would simply chuckle, a sound that would both re-center the four while also lightening their moods further. The north wind's apparent home was in fact just like Chime said. The front of the cave was quite unassuming, appearing as just a circular entrance that reached further and further into what looked to be endless darkness. Sliding on his feet, the north wind led Chime and the other inside, while Mush once again waiting a few extra seconds before moving in himself. Somehow the cave would twist and turn, the only reason for the group's ability to traverse the darkness being the north wind, who would point out when and where to turn, acting as a much-needed guide. Eventually the pitch-black dark would be consumed by orange flickering light. The source of the illumination would quickly be revealed as rows of flames that all hung from the roof of the cave, all suspended on metal trays that hung from ropes, the flames being constantly surrounded by swirling vortexes of wind that kept the fires alive. The north wind slid of his feet like an professional ice skater, spinning quickly to face the rest of the group. "Tada!" he cheered, trying his best to show off his so-called home. His home, however, was just like Chime had predicted. It was a bunch junk. A myriad of Titanic-sized item-formed piles that overflowed in random direction, creating a sort of maze that was only traversable due to the ground's tiny size. The group gave the north wind a blank stare, their lips pressed into thin lines which made the living wind shrink back, rubbing his neck nervously while he craned his neck away. Chime tried to step forward, yet he stumbled once again. The support from the others vanished with his sudden movement. Hands made of wind wrapped around Chime's wrist, their owner immediately trying to prevent another moment of panic. He pulled Chime along into the maze, rapidly firing off what were meant to be words but instead came out as incoherent dribble. The Mirror Man, the Ferryman, and the Pretender blinked, all momentarily stunned. The reactions of the three varied as the Ferryman hurried after Chime and the North Wind, all while he mumbled something under his breath. The Mirror Man was about to follow before he held himself back, an idea suddenly crossing his mind, one he found too perfect to pass up on. Taking a quick glance at the surrounding junk, the Mirror Man was lucky enough to find exactly what he was looking for. Crossing her arms, the Pretender found herself momentarily distracted as the Mirror Man rushed over to a pane of glass that rested against a broken table leg. She raised her eyebrows once the Mirror Man had slipped through the reflective surface, the murky flash of white light acting as a sign that the Mirror Man was going someplace far, at least for the time being. For a second she debated whether or not she should call him back or go after the other three. But then a third option showed itself. The smell of rotten flesh filled the air as Mush finally arrived at the main section of the cave. He held his head down, one hand in his pocket while the other loosely clutched at the cane he had made for Chime. He slipped to a path that diverted off to the left, clearly trying to avoid the others for as long as possible. Clenching her fist to the point her knuckles turned white, the Pretender openly let a sneer stretch across her lips. Her blood boiled, the reminder that Mush was still alive, acting like a flaming knife wound to the gut. Chime's words were the only thing holding her back for going completely ballistic on the living flesh. However, that didn't mean she could air out her feelings in another way. With that, the Pretender slowly turned before she began to stalk after Mush, her steps near silent like a predator hunting its prey. As the north wind pulled Chime into a more open area, the one-armed boy had to press his hand against his forehead to try and stop his head from spinning. The living wind didn't seem to notice. Instead, he seemed slightly panicked as he dashed from one pile to another, clearly trying to find something. Before Chime could regain his friend's attention, the north wind suddenly clapped his hands together before he held out both his arms to the side, sweeping them to the left as if he was clearing a table of its contents. An enormous gust of wind crashed against a small pile of junk, the mix of broken wooden planks and other random objects, flying over to another larger pile that acted almost like a wall. Once the dust had settled, the reason for the north wind's sudden clearance had been revealed. A simple blue leather couch sat almost like a throne, its old weathered seams looking as if they would break apart at any moment. The best part, however, was that the chair was actually the right size, not overly gigantic unlike nearly everything else. Chime gave a passing glance to the north wind, who was fidgeting nervously, swaying back and forth on the balls of his feet. Sending the living wind a small smile, Chime carefully hobbled towards the chair, letting himself sink into the old leather. That made the north wind calm down, if only slightly. However, he still seemed slightly panicked as he began to search the contents of the nearby piles. Okay. He muttered to himself, taking another glance at Chime. Do you need anything else? Food, water, life support? Before Chime could calm him down, the north wind took off into deeper sections of the cave, his form losing the humanoid shape, instead going back to its simplest state of actual wind. A sigh leaked from Chime's mouth, although a soft smile crossed his lips at his friend's attempt of care. He leaned back trying to get comfortable, but his attempt was interrupted by a small flash of white light that was caught by the corner of his eye. An earthy smell slipped through Chime's nose as the Mirror Man appeared around the corner, a mug in one hand and a teacup in the other. He gave Chime an unsure look, the state of his friend still completely surreal to him. Still, he put his plan into action, slowly handing Chime the mug while he himself gently cupped his own drink with both hands. Chime took it without a word, staring into the amber liquid with a gentle gaze. The sight of the tea brought back certain memories, ones that made Chime smile once again, a sight that the Mirror Man took as the sign to start drinking. In perfect sync, they both slowly gulped down the drink, the almost sickly sweet flavor warming their throats just enough to not be painful. Letting out a long breath through his nose, Chime looked up at the Mirror Man, who still looked unsure, his expression riddled with anxiety. Another smile pulled at Chime's lips, although this one was wider yet also gentler, almost like a wave that perfectly smoothed out the sand on the shore. "Thanks, Otto." Otto smiled for the first time in oh so many years, his free hand subconsciously combing through his hair. "Thanks," was all Otto managed to say before he went back to fidgeting, glancing around at the random piles that made up the walls. Coming up with a quick solution to his friend's nerves, Chime nodded to the direction that the north wind had flown away to. "If you don't mind, could you go find North? He's grabbing stuff we don't need." Otto blinked before he nodded, returning back to the pane of broken glass, stepping into it without preamble. Now alone once again, Chime settled his gaze back onto the mug of tea in his hand. Then he clenched his teeth together, biting down the pain that bubbled in his chest as the liquid entered his stomach. The sound of hurried footsteps made Chime force himself to appear calm, which he was able to do just in time for the ferryman to appear out of the maze of junk, his sliver hair briefly falling to his eyes as he looked mostly annoyed. His gaze calmed once, he noticed Chime the ferryman brushing away the tufts of hair that covered his hollowed eyes before he walked over to the one-armed boy leaning against a wooden plank that rested beside the leather chair. Much like the mirror man, a silence passed over the two as the ferryman kept his hands in his pockets while he dropped his head down to the floor. Chime didn't press for his friend to say anything, rather he simply waited for the ferryman to take the first step. The ferryman let out a shaking breath, a giveaway that he was ready to speak. He swallowed, a lump forming in his throat as his voice came out barely above a whisper. I'm sorry." The ferryman gripped the fabric of his pockets, his voice shaking with a mix of self-hatred and overwhelming relief. However, he never had a chance to continue as Chime set down his mug before he placed his hand on the ferryman's shoulder. "Don't," Chime said, his voice stern. Turning his eyes, the ferryman stared at Chime, briefly stunned. "You have nothing to apologize for," Chime stated, the glow of his eyes brightening slightly. The ferryman tried to argue, but Chime cut him off. "I know what you've been doing. You spent this whole time trying to help, trying to be a shield. Why should you be sorry for that?" The ferryman froze, his mind grinding to a halt. Few seconds later, and his mind seemed to somewhat process the idea as his shoulders loosened before he let out a shaking breath, his body quivering as he did so. Yet the guilt in his face remained. Chime tightened his grip in response as he tried to smile, although the light in his eyes dimmed. "It's okay. Let's focus on the now. Okay?" The ferryman slowly nodded, thankful for the change in topic. Chime nodded as well before a thought crossed his mind. Slowly he turned to where the ferryman had came from, tilting his head slightly in thought. "Where's... oh..." Chime trailed off, slowly releasing what the last member of their group was probably doing. Slipping past bits of jutted junk, Mush moved further and further into a more closed-off section of the cave where the light had begun to reach the limits of its range. He was trying to hide from the others that could be seen by anyone, and safe to say he was utterly desperate to achieve it. He threw the cane to the side, the fancy wooden stick bounced around the uneven floor randomly. He hunched over briefly, holding himself against a plank of wood for support. He felt sick, as if the acid in his stomach was melting through insides without any resistance. A couple of grunts was all he managed to use as a sign of discomfort as he tired to push the growing vial back down his throat. Then the footsteps came from behind him. It was small clacks, each sounding a few seconds apart. Mush froze, his body locking into place like a deer in headlights, his feeling of sick exploding to new heights. His worst fears were coming to life, something so much worse than simple being attacked like before. With enough terror to fill a natural disaster scenario, Mush slowly and painfully turned his head to the source of the noise. The pretender creeped into his view, her form hunched forward slightly like a beast ready to maul at a helpless rabbit. Mush flinched from the sight, squeezing his eyes shut on pure reflex. The pretender let out a long breath, her fingers gripped a nearby bit of wood with enough force to break it apart like cheap, brittle crackers. However, she didn't speak. Instead, she just stared at the living flesh, her blood boiling with each passing second, yet she never made a move. But to Mush that was worse. At least when she had tried to kill him, the pain took most of his mind's focus, but with what she was doing now he had no such luxury. And so he waited, bracing himself for whatever the pretender had to say. "You made Chime kill him." Mush wasn't ready for that. The statement acted like a stake through the heart as Mush instantly crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath as if he had been shot. He felt as if his throat was closed up, his hands and knees scarping against the jagged stone floor. Gauging out clumps of flesh, Mush turned towards the pretender, staring into her cold, dead eyes with panic, and shook. "You know?" He coughed, trying a failing to push himself upright. The pretender kept her gaze locked towards Mush's downright pathetic state, a sneer once again crossing her lips. "We all know. You really think we wouldn't notice something like that?" The question was rhetorical. Mush knew that for a fact, but it did little to downsize the pain twisting in his heart. "Look," he tried to plea. "I'm sore." He was cut off by the pretender, who slammed her palm against a random bar of metal, the gigantic alloy instantly vanishing into nothing upon contact. "Don't," she said, holding out a hand that shook with nearly uncontrollable hate. "Don't you dare." She paused, taking in a painful long breath through her nose as she tried with all her might to not just crush the living flesh like a juicy grape. As the pretender glances back down to Mush, she found her next words failed to leave her throat. She had absolutely no clue on what to say, and now that she really thought about it, she didn't really have a plan when she started to follow him. Part of her, the emotional side of her, once again wanted to rip Mush to shreds. Yet she held herself back, Chime's statement replaying itself in her mind. She knew she knew that if she stared, she wouldn't stop. That didn't mean she had to like it through. However, she did understand its importance, no matter how much it made her grind her teeth together. And so she just stood there, periodically curling in her fingers while her emotions clashed together. Mush watched the pretender like a deer in headlights, his absolute fear and worry locking in place as he waited for her next move. It wasn't the pretender that made the next move, however, as the thud of booted footsteps slowly made their way towards the two. The pretender turned just in time to see the ferryman appear from around another corner, one hand shoved in his pocket while the other was used to point towards the way he came from. "Come on, the others are waiting," he stated simple before he began to make his way back without another word. Mush slowly pushed himself to his feet, using the random pieces of junk to support his shaking legs. He froze for the final time as the pretender sent him one last hate-filled glare. Mush felt his stomach burn again, though he tried his best to ignore it. He slouched forward, trying to appear as small as possible before he slowly followed the pretender, who was following after the ferryman. The three twisted through the small gaps in between the piles of junk, each completely lost in thought. For the ferryman, what was to come, or rather what would now come thanks to Chime's return. For the pretender, she focused on the now and how everything had been happening so fast it felt as if had been thrown through a vortex. And finally, for Mush, he focused on the past and on everything he had done wrong. So much wrong. Back in the central area of the cave, Chime slowly drummed his fingers along the arm-rest of the chair, waiting for the other three to arrive. Up directly above Chime sat the North Wind, who was settled on top of a junk pile, swinging his legs back and forth as if staying still would cause him to disintegrate. To Chime's left stood Otto, who was still slowly sipping away at his somehow still warm tea, a look of apprehension plastered across his face. He fiddled with the cuffs of his white shirt, the fabric looking to trap heat around Otto's wrists, making the man sweat slightly. Soon enough the other arrived, with the ferryman moved to stand at Chime's right, the guide to nowhere crossing his hands over his chest as he lowered his head slightly. The pretender moved next, stepped towards a sheet of metal that leaned against a somewhat large pile of rocks. Last and definitely least, Mush slumped his way in, trying to remain as unnoticeable as possible. It didn't work. The others saw him immediately, all of them gaining their own expressions of disgust and rage. Towards the space furthest away from everyone, silently sitting in the cold hard stone floor. With that, the six apexes of nowhere sat in silence, the only sound being the gentle rushing of the wind. No one said anything, or rather no one had the bravery needed to say something, as everyone, even Chime, found any sort of idea sliced apart by their own minds before anything could form. Then came a cough, a sound so weak and pathetic it could only belong to one person. Mush leaned forward, his eyes remaining downcast as the others all slowly craned their gazes toward him. He felt as his throat was closing once more, yet he pushed it down, trying with all his might to ask something that had been on his mind since he and Chime had left the Pale City. "So?" He stared, however, he immediately winced away when the others growled in, annoying at him doing, well, anything. Yet his kept going, pushing through his own fears to try and make any form of progress. What's the actual plan?" Despite the others' unbridled hatred of Mush, they found themselves considering his words as they glanced to Chime, who seemed slightly taken aback. Chime blinked for a few seconds before he shrugged. I don't know.